Before we begin tonight's journey into the mysterious encounters at Nellis Air Force Base, I want to take a moment to check in with you. If you're listening to this, you might be seeking comfort, distraction, or simply a peaceful way to drift into sleep. Whatever brought you here tonight, you're welcome. Sometimes our minds carry the weight of the day, worries about tomorrow, regrets about yesterday, or simply the endless chatter that keeps us awake when we most need rest. That's perfectly normal, and tonight we're going to let those thoughts gently fade as we explore one of the most intriguing military encounters with the unknown. If your mind feels restless tonight, if sleep seems elusive, that's okay. Sometimes our thoughts need time to settle, like dust after a desert wind. There's no pressure here, no expectation except to be present with yourself in this moment. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, and know that whatever you're carrying today, you don't have to solve it all right now. For now though, let's allow ourselves to settle into this moment. Take a deep breath if you'd like, and know that for the next couple of hours, you can simply listen, rest, and let your mind wander to the vast Nevada desert, where the impossible once seemed to walk among us. The Mojave Desert stretches endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of silence broken only by the whisper of wind through Joshua trees and the distant hum of military aircraft. Here, where the mountains meet the sky in shimmering heat waves, the United States Air Force maintains one of its most secretive installations, Nellis Air Force Base, home to the test pilot school and guardian of countless classified operations. It was here, in this landscape of infinite horizons and burning sunsets, that Senior Airman Charles James Hall first encountered beings that would challenge everything he thought he knew about our place in the universe. The year was 1964, and America was deep in the throes of the Cold War, when secrets were currency, and the desert held more mysteries than any government manual could catalogue. Charles Hall was 24 years old when he received his assignment to the weather station at Indian Springs, a remote outpost within the sprawling complex of Nellis Air Force Base. Born in rural Minnesota in 1940, Hall had grown up on a farm where the nearest neighbour was miles away, where the night sky stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, and where a young man learned to find comfort in solitude. His father had been a practical man who taught him to observe the natural world with patience and precision, skills that would serve him well in both his military career and the extraordinary encounters that lay ahead. The Hall family farm sat on nearly 200 acres of rolling prairie, where corn and soybeans grew in neat rows that stretched toward distant tree lines. Charles had spent countless hours of his childhood walking those fields, learning to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes, the way the wind shifted before a storm, how animals behaved when atmospheric pressure dropped, the particular quality of light that preceded either fair skies or violent thunderstorms. His mother often said he had an intuitive understanding of the natural rhythms that governed their agricultural life, an ability to sense changes in the environment before instruments could measure them. During the long Minnesota winters, when snow blanketed the farm and the temperature dropped well below zero, Charles would often stand at his bedroom window and stare up at the star-filled sky. The aurora borealis would sometimes dance across the northern horizon, sheets of green and blue light that seemed to connect earth to heaven in ways that filled him with wonder. His grandfather, a Swedish immigrant who had homesteaded the original 40 acres, would tell stories of strange lights and unexplained phenomena that he had witnessed during his decades of farming the harsh Minnesota prairie. These tales, dismissed by adults as folklore, planted seeds of curiosity in young Charles that would bloom years later in the Nevada desert. Perhaps this childhood of wide-open spaces and endless skies prepared him for what was to come, though nothing could have truly prepared him for the beings he would soon encounter in the Nevada desert. After graduating from high school in 1958, Hall had briefly attended the University of Minnesota, studying meteorology and atmospheric sciences. However, the financial pressures of farm life, and his desire to serve his country during the tense years of the Cold War, led him to enlist in the United States Air Force in 1962. Basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas had been a challenging adjustment for the quiet farm boy from Minnesota. The heat, the noise, the constant presence of other people, all of it was foreign to someone accustomed to the peaceful solitude of a rural life. But Hall's natural aptitude for technical subjects and his calm demeanour under pressure quickly caught the attention of his instructors. When it came time for specialised training assignments, he was selected for Weather Observer School, a rigorous program that would prepare him for meteorological duties at military installations around the world. The assignment seemed routine enough. Weather observers were essential to flight operations at Nellis, particularly given the base's role in testing experimental aircraft and training test pilots. The weather station at Indian Springs sat approximately 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas, positioned strategically to provide meteorological data for the various ranges and training areas scattered throughout the vast military reservation. Hall's job was to take regular weather observations, maintain equipment, and radio reports back to base operations, a solitary posting that suited his temperament perfectly. But Indian Springs was far more than just another weather station. The location carried a weight of history that stretched back centuries, long before the first military personnel had ever set foot in the Nevada desert. Indian Springs had been a way station for travellers since the 1860s, when pioneers and miners would stop at the natural springs to water their animals and refill their canteens before continuing their journey across the unforgiving desert. The springs themselves were a geological anomaly, clear, cold water bubbling up from deep underground aquifers, creating a small oasis of green vegetation in an otherwise barren landscape. Native American tribes had known of the springs for centuries before European settlers arrived. The Paiute and Shoshone peoples considered them sacred, a gift from the earth spirits in a land where water meant the difference between life and death. According to tribal oral histories, the springs were also associated with mysterious beings who walked the desert at night, tall, pale figures who seemed to glide across the sand without leaving tracks. These stories, passed down through generations of tribal elders, spoke of encounters with otherworldly visitors who possessed knowledge of the stars and the hidden pathways between worlds. The Spanish explorers who first mapped the region in the 18th century also left accounts of strange phenomena in their journals. Father Francisco Garcés, travelling through the area in 1776, wrote of lights that moved across the desert floor at night, following patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural phenomena. He described encounters with what he called Los Altos Blancos, the tall white ones, beings who appeared at the edge of his campfire's light and vanished when approached. The good father attributed these visions to desert mirages and spiritual testing, but his detailed descriptions would prove remarkably consistent with accounts that would emerge 2 centuries later. By the 1940s, the military had recognized the strategic value of this location. The springs provided a reliable water source, and the surrounding desert offered vast, unpopulated areas perfect for weapons testing and flight training. During World War II, the Army Air Corps established gunnery ranges in the area, and pilots would practice aerial combat maneuvers over the empty expanses, where only jackrabbits and desert tortoises witnessed their training exercises. The isolation was both a blessing and a challenge. It provided the secrecy necessary for classified operations, but it also meant that personnel stationed there lived in almost complete isolation from the outside world. The establishment of Nellis Air Force Base in 1950 transformed the region into one of America's most important military training facilities. Named after Lieutenant William Harrell Nellis, a fighter pilot killed in action during World War II, the base became home to advanced tactical training programs and experimental aircraft testing. The Thunderbirds aerial demonstration team was based there, along with the prestigious Fighter Weapons School, where the Air Force's elite pilots came to master advanced combat techniques. When Hall arrived at Indian Springs in 1964, the Cold War was at its height. The Cuban Missile Crisis was still fresh in everyone's memory, and the United States military was engaged in a massive build-up of both conventional and nuclear capabilities. The ongoing conflict in Vietnam was escalating, and there was a palpable sense of tension in military installations across the country. Nellis Air Force Base had become a crucial testing ground for new aircraft, weapon systems, and tactical procedures. The base was home to the Fighter Weapons School, where the Air Force's best pilots came to learn advanced combat techniques, and the Test Pilot School, where experimental aircraft pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the skies above the desert. The secrecy surrounding many of Nellis's operations meant that personnel were often unaware of the full scope of activities taking place on the vast reservation. Classified projects were compartmentalized, with each individual knowing only what was necessary for their specific duties. This culture of secrecy would prove both a blessing and a burden for Hall, as his encounters with the unknown began to unfold. The weather station itself was a modest collection of buildings and equipment positioned to provide optimal atmospheric readings. There was the main observation building, where Hall would take his readings and make his reports, a small living quarters where he would spend his off-duty hours, and various pieces of meteorological equipment scattered around the compound. The work was methodical and precise, recording temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure, and cloud conditions at regular intervals throughout the day and night. Each observation had to be taken at specific times and recorded according to strict military protocols, then transmitted via radio to base operations where the data would be compiled and disseminated to flight operations and other units. The equipment Hall worked with represented the cutting edge of meteorological technology for the early 1960s. There were mercury barometers for measuring atmospheric pressure, anemometers for wind speed, wind vanes for direction, and thermometers housed in specially designed shelters to ensure accurate temperature readings. Humidity was measured using psychrometers, and cloud ceiling heights were determined using powerful searchlights and clinometers. All of this equipment required regular calibration and maintenance, tasks that Hall approached with the same careful attention to detail that his father had taught him when maintaining farm equipment back in Minnesota. Hall's days fell into a predictable rhythm that connected him to the ancient cycles of the desert. He would wake before dawn to take the early morning observations, watching the desert slowly emerge from darkness as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and red. The desert morning was often the most beautiful time of day, when the air was cool and clear, and the harsh landscape revealed its subtle beauty. Barrel cacti stood like sentinels in the distance, their arms reaching toward the sky, while smaller desert plants created intricate patterns of green and brown across the valley floor. The silence during these early hours was profound, a deep quiet that seemed to extend beyond mere absence of sound into something approaching the sacred. As he worked through his morning routine, Hall would often pause to appreciate the incredible vista that surrounded him. To the east, the sun would rise over distant mountain ranges, casting long shadows across the valley floor and highlighting every ridge and crevice in the desert landscape. The light changed constantly throughout the day, transforming the seemingly barren terrain into a canvas of subtle colours and textures. What appeared monotonous to the casual observer revealed itself to Hall's patient eye as an ecosystem of remarkable complexity and beauty. During the day, Hall would maintain his equipment, check and calibrate instruments, and take his scheduled observations. The desert heat was intense, often reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sun was merciless in its intensity. The air would shimmer with heat waves that created optical illusions on the horizon, making distant objects appear to float or distorting their true shapes and sizes. But Hall had grown accustomed to the climate, learning to appreciate the stark beauty of the landscape and the profound silence that enveloped the weather station. The isolation meant that Hall had to be entirely self-sufficient. He maintained his own generator for electrical power, managed his water supply carefully, and kept detailed maintenance logs for all his equipment. Supply runs came in frequently, usually once a week, when a truck would arrive from the main base with food, fuel, and any replacement parts that might be needed. These visits were brief, typically lasting only long enough to unload supplies and receive Hall's written reports. The drivers were usually in a hurry to return to base, leaving Hall alone again with his instruments and the vast desert silence. In the evening he would watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and at night the stars would emerge in numbers that city dwellers could never imagine. The desert night sky was a revelation. Thousands upon thousands of stars visible in the clear, dry air, the Milky Way stretching like a river of light across the heavens. On moonless nights, the darkness was so complete that Hall could barely see his hand in front of his face, yet the starlight was bright enough to cast faint shadows on the ground. These were the moments when he felt most connected to the cosmic immensity that surrounded him, when the boundaries between earth and sky seemed to dissolve in the profound quiet of the desert night. It was during one of these evening observations in late spring of 1964 that Hall first noticed something unusual. He was outside the observation building, taking wind readings with a handheld anemometer, when he saw movement in the distance. At first, he assumed it was wildlife, perhaps a small herd of wild horses or burros that occasionally wandered through the area. The desert supported more life than most people realized, and Hall had become accustomed to seeing various animals during his observations. Coyotes were common, as were jackrabbits, and occasionally he would spot a small herd of wild horses that roamed the more remote areas of the military reservation. But as he watched through his binoculars, carefully adjusting the focus to get a clearer view, he realized that what he was seeing didn't match any animal he knew. The figures were tall, much taller than any human, and they moved with an odd, graceful gait across the desert floor. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, Hall could see that they were pale, almost luminescent in the fading light of dusk. They seemed to be walking in a loose formation, moving from north to south across the valley, and they showed no apparent concern for his presence at the weather station. What struck Hall most about these figures was the effortless way they moved across the terrain. The desert floor around Indian Springs was not smooth. It was broken by rocks, small gullies, patches of dense vegetation, and areas of loose sand that could make walking treacherous, especially in fading light. Yet these beings moved as if they were intimately familiar with every obstacle, gliding over the uneven ground with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. Their movements had a quality that reminded Hall of dancers, or perhaps birds in flight, purposeful and elegant, but somehow not quite bound by the same physical constraints that governed human locomotion. Hall's first instinct was to reach for his radio and report what he was seeing to base operations, but something made him hesitate. These beings, for he was becoming convinced that they were not human, moved with a purposefulness that suggested intelligence, and they seemed to be following a specific route across the desert. They weren't behaving like lost travelers or unauthorized personnel who had somehow breached the security perimeter. They moved like they belonged here, like they had been walking these desert paths long before the Air Force had ever arrived. As Hall watched, one of the figures stopped and turned toward the weather station. Even at this distance, Hall had the unmistakable feeling that the being was looking directly at him, studying him with the same curiosity that he was studying it. The moment stretched between them across the empty desert, two different forms of consciousness acknowledging each other's presence in the vast silence of the Nevada wilderness. Then, as quietly as they had appeared, the figures resumed their movement and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Hall remained outside for another hour, scanning the horizon with his binoculars, but saw nothing more. When he finally went inside to complete his weather report, he found himself uncertain about what, if anything, he should include in his official log. That night Hall lay awake in his small quarters, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he'd witnessed. The rational part of his mind searched for conventional explanations. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, or atmospheric conditions that had distorted his perception of ordinary objects or animals. But the more he replayed the encounter in his mind, the more convinced he became that he had seen something genuinely extraordinary. The beings had been too tall to be human, and their movements had been too coordinated and purposeful to be animals. They had exhibited what appeared to be intelligence and awareness, and they had seemed completely at ease in the harsh desert environment. Most intriguingly, they had shown no fear or surprise at the presence of the weather station, as if they were familiar with human installations and activities in the area. Over the following days, Hall found himself paying closer attention to the desert around him. He began to notice things that he had previously overlooked: unusual tracks in the sand that didn't match any known animal, areas where the desert vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that suggested regular passage, and a sense of being watched that he couldn't quite shake. The weather station's location provided an excellent vantage point for observing the surrounding desert. To the north, the land rose gradually toward distant mountains, while to the south, it stretched away toward Las Vegas and the Colorado River. To the east and west, the valley extended for miles, broken only by occasional outcroppings of rock and clusters of desert vegetation. It was a landscape that revealed its secrets slowly, and Hall was beginning to understand that those secrets were more profound than he had ever imagined. And as the weeks passed, Hall's encounters with the tall figures became more frequent. He began to recognize patterns in their appearances. They seemed to favor certain times of day, particularly the hours around dawn and dusk when the desert light was soft and the heat was less intense. They appeared to follow established routes across the valley, moving with the confidence of beings who knew the terrain intimately. Hall also began to notice that the beings seemed to be aware of his schedule and activities. They would often appear when he was outside taking observations, as if they were deliberately timing their movements to coincide with his presence. This suggested a level of intelligence and planning that both fascinated and unsettled him. Were they studying him as intently as he was studying them? The isolation of the weather station meant that Hall had few opportunities to discuss his observations with others. His only regular contact with other personnel came through radio communications with base operations, and these were strictly limited to official weather reports and administrative matters. Hall found himself in the unusual position of being the sole witness to what might be the most significant discovery in human history, yet unable to share his knowledge with anyone who might understand its implications. As spring turned to summer, and the desert heat became even more intense, Hall's encounters with the tall beings continued to evolve. What had begun as distant sightings gradually became closer encounters, and Hall began to understand that these beings were not simply passing through the area. They were residents of this desert, as much a part of the landscape as the Joshua trees and the mountains that surrounded them. He began to discern patterns in their behavior, routes that they followed with the regularity of commuters, and preferred times for their activities that seemed to correlate with atmospheric conditions and lunar phases. The more Hall observed these beings, the more questions arose in his mind. Where did they come from? Where were they going during these regular traverses of the valley? What was their purpose? And why did they seem so comfortable in an environment that was hostile to most forms of life? Most intriguingly, why did they appear to be aware of his presence and schedule, yet show no fear or hostility toward the human installation in their territory? Hall began keeping detailed personal notes about his sightings, separate from his official weather logs. He recorded the times, weather conditions, direction of travel, number of figures observed, and any unusual behaviors he witnessed. These notes, written in a small notebook that he kept locked in his personal effects, would eventually become some of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of extraterrestrial contact ever recorded. But at the time, Hall was simply a careful observer, trying to understand a phenomenon that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The implications of what he was witnessing were staggering. If these beings were indeed not human, then their presence suggested that Earth was being visited by intelligent life from elsewhere in the universe. The casual nature of their presence, their apparent familiarity with the area, and their seeming comfort with human military activities suggested that this contact might have been ongoing for some time. Were there others in the military who knew about these beings? Was this contact part of some classified program that was beyond Hall's security clearance? As the summer progressed and his encounters became more frequent and detailed, Hall found himself becoming not just an observer, but almost a participant in whatever drama was unfolding in the Nevada desert. The tall beings seemed to accept his presence, neither seeking contact nor avoiding the area around the weather station. Sometimes they would pause in their movements when they noticed him outside with his instruments, observing him with what appeared to be the same scientific curiosity that he was directing toward them. These moments of mutual observation across the desert created a strange sense of connection, as if two different forms of consciousness were slowly learning to coexist in the harsh beauty of the Mojave wilderness. And so began what would become a multi-year relationship between a young airman from Minnesota and beings whose origins lay far beyond the Earth's atmosphere. In the vast silence of the Nevada desert, where the military tested its most advanced technology and guarded its most sensitive secrets. An even more extraordinary secret was walking freely under the endless sky, challenging everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. As summer deepened into the scorching heat of July 1964, Hall's encounters with the tall beings began to take on a new dimension. What had started as distant observations across the desert floor gradually evolved into something approaching genuine contact. The beings seemed to be growing more comfortable with his presence, their routes taking them closer to the weather station, their movements more deliberate and purposeful when he was outside taking his observations. It was during one particularly clear evening, when the temperature had finally dropped below 90 degrees, and a gentle breeze was stirring the desert air, that Hall experienced his first close encounter with one of the beings. He was outside calibrating his anemometer, a routine task that required him to position the instrument in an open area, away from any structures that might interfere with wind readings. The sun had set perhaps an hour earlier, leaving the sky painted in deep purples and oranges, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening heavens. As Hall worked with his equipment, carefully adjusting the instrument's calibration according to the technical manual he had memorized, he became aware of a presence nearby. It was not a sound that alerted him, but rather a subtle change in the quality of the silence around him. The desert had its own acoustic signature, the gentle whisper of wind through sagebrush, the distant call of a coyote, the almost inaudible settling sounds of cooling rock and sand. But now there was something else, a quality of attention in the air that made him look up from his work. Standing perhaps 50 yards away, clearly visible in the fading light, was one of the tall beings. Up close, Hall could see details that had been impossible to discern at greater distances. The being was indeed remarkably tall, perhaps 7 feet in height, with a slender build that somehow conveyed both fragility and strength. Its skin appeared to be pale, almost translucent, with a quality that seemed to capture and reflect the ambient light in unusual ways. The being's clothing, if it could be called that, appeared to be some form of close-fitting garment that covered most of its body, leaving only the head, hands, and what appeared to be feet visible. What struck Hall most forcefully was the being's face. The features were undeniably humanoid, yet distinctly different from any human he had ever seen. The head was larger in proportion to the body than would be normal for a human, and the eyes were particularly prominent, large, dark, and possessed of an intelligence that was immediately apparent. The being's gaze was fixed directly on Hall, studying him with an intensity that was both fascinating and slightly unnerving. For several long moments, the two beings, human and otherworldly, simply observed each other across the desert landscape. Hall found himself thinking of those childhood moments back in Minnesota, when he would encounter a deer or other wild animal during his wanderings through the farm's woodlands. There was the same sense of mutual assessment, of two different forms of consciousness trying to understand each other's intentions and capabilities. The being's posture conveyed no sense of threat or aggression. Indeed, there was something almost scholarly about its demeanour, as if it were conducting its own careful study of human behaviour and technology. Its attention seemed to shift between Hall himself and the meteorological equipment he was working with, and Hall had the distinct impression that the being was trying to understand the purpose and function of the various instruments scattered around the weather station. Slowly, carefully, Hall raised his hand in what he hoped would be recognized as a gesture of peaceful greeting. The being's large eyes followed the movement with obvious interest, and after a moment's hesitation, it raised its own hand in what appeared to be a mirror of Hall's gesture. The being's hand was longer and more slender than a human hand, with fingers that seemed to possess additional joints, but the gesture itself was unmistakably an attempt at communication. This simple exchange seemed to establish a new level of understanding between them. The being took a few steps closer, moving with that same fluid grace that Hall had observed during his distant sightings. Its movement across the desert floor was remarkably quiet, and Hall noticed that it seemed to leave very little trace of its passage on the sand and loose soil. This was particularly remarkable, given the being's height and the difficult terrain of the desert. As the being approached, Hall became aware of other subtle details about its appearance and behaviour. There was no visible breathing pattern that he could detect, and the being's skin seemed to maintain the same pale luminescence regardless of the changing light conditions. Most intriguingly, Hall began to sense that the being was somehow aware of his thoughts and emotions, responding to his mental state in ways that suggested some form of telepathic sensitivity. When Hall felt a moment of nervousness about the encounter, the being immediately stopped its approach and seemed to project a sense of calm reassurance. When Hall's scientific curiosity overcame his apprehension, and he leaned forward slightly to get a better look at the being's unusual features, it responded by turning slightly to give him a better view of its profile. These subtle interactions suggested a level of awareness and responsiveness that went far beyond simple observation. The encounter lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though Hall found it difficult to judge the passage of time accurately. The being seemed content to simply observe and be observed, occasionally shifting its position or attention but never displaying any signs of impatience or discomfort. As the last light faded from the western sky and the desert settled into full darkness, the being began to withdraw, backing away slowly while maintaining eye contact with Hall. Before disappearing entirely into the darkness, the being did something that would puzzle Hall for weeks afterward. It raised both hands to chest level and performed a series of precise, deliberate gestures that seemed too purposeful to be random movements. The gestures had the quality of sign language or perhaps some form of ritual communication, though their meaning was completely opaque to Hall. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the being turned and walked away into the night, leaving Hall alone with his instruments, and a profound sense that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet comprehend. That night Hall found it almost impossible to sleep. He lay in his small quarters, staring at the ceiling and replaying every detail of the encounter in his mind. The being's presence had been so real, so undeniably physical, that it eliminated any possibility that his earlier sightings had been hallucinations or misidentifications. He had been close enough to see the texture of the being's skin, to observe the way its unusual clothing seemed to move with its body, to study the remarkable intelligence that shone in its large, dark eyes. The implications of what he had experienced were staggering. The being was clearly not human, yet it was obviously intelligent and possessed of advanced capabilities that went far beyond anything in human technology. Its ability to move silently across difficult terrain, its apparent telepathic sensitivity, and the sophisticated quality of its attempted communication all suggested a level of development that far exceeded human civilization. Over the following days, Hall found himself constantly scanning the horizon during his routine observations, hoping for another encounter, but also feeling somewhat apprehensive about what such contact might mean. His work continued as usual, recording temperature, humidity, wind conditions, and atmospheric pressure at regular intervals. But his attention was increasingly focused on watching for signs of the tall beings and trying to understand their patterns of activity. He began to notice that the beings seemed to favour certain atmospheric conditions for their activities. They appeared most frequently during periods of low humidity and minimal wind, particularly when atmospheric pressure was steady or rising. This suggested to Hall that their activities might be affected by weather conditions in ways that paralleled human comfort and efficiency. It also indicated a level of sophistication in their understanding of environmental factors that implied considerable experience with Earth's climate and atmospheric patterns. The beings also seemed to have preferred routes across the valley, following paths that avoided the most difficult terrain, while still maintaining straight-line travel between whatever destinations they were seeking. Hall began mapping these routes in his personal notebook, creating a detailed chart of their movement patterns that revealed a network of pathways crisscrossing the desert in directions that seemed to connect distant points beyond the horizon. As July progressed into August, Hall's encounters with the beings became more frequent and increasingly sophisticated. The initial tentative contact gave way to more extended observations, with individual beings sometimes spending an hour or more in the vicinity of the weather station. They seemed particularly interested in his meteorological equipment, often approaching close enough to examine the instruments in detail. During one memorable encounter in mid-August, Hall was taking evening wind readings when two of the beings approached from different directions, converging near the weather station in what appeared to be a planned meeting. They communicated with each other using a combination of gestures and what sounded like very soft vocalizations, too quiet for Hall to hear clearly from his position near the observation building. One of the beings, slightly taller than the other, and with what appeared to be subtle differences in its clothing or equipment, seemed to be in a position of authority or seniority. This being directed the other's attention to various aspects of the weather station, pointing out specific instruments and structures as if providing some form of instruction or briefing. The interaction had the quality of a teaching moment, suggesting that Hall's presence and activities were subjects of ongoing study and discussion among the beings. After their conference, both beings turned their attention to Hall, observing him with that same intense scientific curiosity he had come to recognize. The senior being approached closer than any had previously, coming within perhaps 20 feet of where Hall stood near his anemometer. At this distance, Hall could see even more detail about the being's appearance and equipment. The being's clothing appeared to be made of some material that had properties unlike any fabric Hall was familiar with. It seemed to shift slightly in colour and texture depending on lighting conditions, and it appeared to provide perfect climate control despite the extreme heat of the Nevada summer. The being showed no signs of discomfort from the temperature, which was still well over 90 degrees even after sunset. Most remarkably, Hall began to experience what he could only describe as direct mental communication with the being. It was not telepathy in the science fiction sense of hearing another's thoughts as words in his mind, but rather a direct transmission of concepts, emotions and images that somehow bypassed language entirely. The being seemed to be conveying a sense of curiosity about human technology and purposes, along with what felt like approval or appreciation for Hall's careful, methodical approach to his work. The communication also carried undertones of vast age and experience, as if the being had been observing human activities for a very long time, and found Hall's particular assignment and demeanour to be somehow significant or noteworthy. There was a quality of patience in the mental contact that suggested these beings operated on timescales far longer than human experience, viewing events and developments from perspectives that encompassed decades or perhaps centuries. As August drew to a close, Hall realized that his relationship with the tall beings had evolved far beyond simple observation. He was becoming a participant in what appeared to be a carefully managed contact scenario, with the beings gradually increasing their level of interaction and communication as they assessed his reactions and capabilities. The isolation of the weather station, which had initially seemed like a lonely assignment, now appeared to be perfectly suited for this extraordinary form of first contact. The beings seemed to understand the sensitive nature of Hall's position within the military structure. They never appeared during times when supply trucks were scheduled to arrive, and they seemed to time their visits to avoid any activities that might be observed or reported by other personnel. This suggested not only intelligence and planning capabilities, but also a sophisticated understanding of human organizational structures and the importance of maintaining secrecy around their contact. By the end of his second month at Indian Springs, Hall had begun to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history: ongoing, systematic contact between humanity and beings from another world. The implications were staggering, not just for science and technology, but for humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Yet the everyday reality of his situation was somehow both profound and mundane. He continued his routine weather observations while gradually becoming part of what might be the most significant development in human civilization. As he prepared his evening reports and settled into his quarters each night, Hall found himself wondering what the next phase of this contact might bring. The beings had demonstrated patience, intelligence, and what appeared to be benevolent intentions. They seemed to be following some form of protocol for contact with humanity, gradually increasing the level of interaction as they assessed his trustworthiness and stability. The desert night sky, which had always seemed vast and mysterious, now held new meaning for Hall. Somewhere among those countless stars was the home of these remarkable beings who had chosen to make contact with a young weather observer in the Nevada desert. As he lay in his bunk listening to the profound silence of the desert night, Hall understood that his life had become part of a story much larger than anything he had ever imagined possible. As September arrived in the Nevada desert, bringing with it the first hints of cooler weather and longer nights, Hall's relationship with the tall beings entered a new phase of complexity and understanding. The scorching heat of summer began to give way to more moderate temperatures, and with this change came an increase in the frequency and duration of his encounters. What had begun as brief, tentative contacts gradually evolved into extended interactions that sometimes lasted for hours. It was during one of these longer encounters in early September that Hall first witnessed what he would later describe as the being's technology in action. He was conducting his routine evening observations when he noticed an unusual glow on the northern horizon, different from anything he had seen before. Unlike the harsh, artificial lighting that sometimes emanated from aircraft or ground vehicles, this light had a soft, almost organic quality that seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with some unknown pattern. As Hall watched through his binoculars, the light source appeared to be moving slowly across the desert floor, following one of the established routes that he had mapped in his notebook over the previous weeks. The glow was not concentrated in a single point, but seemed to emanate from an area perhaps 50 feet in diameter, creating a soft illumination that revealed the desert landscape in remarkable detail without the harsh shadows typically created by artificial lighting. Within this pool of gentle radiance, Hall could see several of the tall beings moving with their characteristic fluid grace, but what captured his attention most powerfully was the apparent source of the illumination, a craft or vehicle that defied every assumption he had developed about transportation technology. The object appeared to be roughly disc-shaped, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and it moved approximately 6 feet above the ground without any visible means of propulsion. There was no sound associated with the craft's movement, no downdraft or disturbance of the desert vegetation below it, and no visible exhaust or energy discharge of any kind. It simply glided across the landscape as silently and effortlessly as the beings themselves walked, maintaining a perfectly steady altitude and speed that suggested a level of technological sophistication far beyond anything in human experience. The craft's surface appeared to be made of some material that both absorbed and reflected light in ways that made it difficult to focus on directly. It seemed to shift between solid opacity and a kind of translucent quality that allowed glimpses of internal structures or spaces. Occasionally, Hall could see what appeared to be the silhouettes of beings moving within the craft, going about activities that he could not begin to understand. As the craft approached the area around the weather station, it began to slow and eventually came to a complete stop, approximately 200 yards from Hall's position. The gentle glow continued to emanate from its surface, creating a circle of soft illumination that transformed the harsh desert landscape into something almost ethereal. Within this light, several of the tall beings disembarked from the craft, stepping down from what appeared to be an opening that manifested in its surface without any visible door or mechanism. Hall watched in fascination as the beings began what appeared to be a systematic survey of the area around the weather station. They moved in a coordinated pattern, examining the terrain, vegetation, and various features of the landscape with the methodical thoroughness of scientific researchers. Some carried what appeared to be instruments or devices, though their design and function were completely foreign to Hall's understanding of technology. One of the beings, whom Hall had begun to recognize from previous encounters by subtle differences in height and posture, approached the weather station directly. This being, whom Hall had mentally designated as the apparent leader or senior researcher of the group, seemed particularly interested in the meteorological equipment and began a detailed examination of each instrument. What happened next challenged Hall's understanding of the being's capabilities even further. As the being examined his equipment, Hall began to receive clear mental impressions of the instrument's functions and purposes, as if the being was somehow accessing his knowledge and understanding of meteorological science. But the communication was not one way. Hall also began to perceive concepts and information that were clearly coming from the being's own knowledge base. Through this remarkable form of mental sharing, Hall began to understand that the beings possessed an incredibly sophisticated understanding of atmospheric science and planetary weather systems. Their knowledge encompassed not only Earth's climate patterns but also the atmospheric dynamics of numerous other worlds. The beings seemed to be comparing Earth's atmospheric conditions to those of other planets, making assessments and calculations that were far beyond Hall's comprehension. The mental communication also conveyed information about the being's long-term presence on Earth. Hall received impressions of observations and studies that had been ongoing for decades, possibly centuries. The beings had been monitoring Earth's atmospheric changes, technological development, and human activities with the patience and thoroughness of dedicated scientists studying a complex and evolving system. Most remarkably, Hall began to understand that his assignment to the weather station had not been entirely coincidental. The beings had somehow influenced or arranged for a suitable human observer to be stationed at this location, someone with the appropriate temperament and scientific background to serve as a contact point. The isolation of Indian Springs, combined with Hall's methodical nature and openness to unusual phenomena, had made him an ideal candidate for this unprecedented role. As the weeks of September passed, these extended encounters became more frequent and increasingly educational. The beings seemed to be conducting a careful program of contact and information exchange, gradually expanding Hall's understanding of their presence on Earth and their long-term objectives. Through the mental communication, he learned that the tall beings were not recent arrivals to Earth, but had maintained a presence here for an extended period, possibly since before the arrival of European settlers in North America. Their base of operations, he came to understand, was located in a network of underground facilities scattered throughout the desert southwest, with the primary installation situated somewhere in the remote areas of the Nevada test site. These facilities had been constructed using technology that was virtually undetectable by human instruments and were designed to have minimal impact on the desert ecosystem above them. The beings themselves, Hall learned, were representatives of a civilization that had originated on a world orbiting a star system many light years from Earth. They had developed the technology for interstellar travel thousands of years ago and had been exploring and studying other worlds for much of their recorded history. Earth had been identified as a planet of particular interest due to its complex biosphere and the rapid development of intelligent life. What fascinated the beings most about Earth was not just the diversity of life forms, but the remarkable speed with which human civilization had developed. From their perspective, which encompassed timescales measured in millennia, humanity's transition from primitive agricultural societies to spacefaring technology had occurred almost instantaneously. This rapid development had created both opportunities and concerns that required careful study and monitoring. The being's presence on Earth was part of a long-term research project designed to understand the factors that had enabled humanity's rapid technological advancement. They were particularly interested in human creativity, adaptability, and the complex social structures that had emerged during the species' development. However, they were also concerned about humanity's tendency toward conflict and the potential for advanced technology to be used destructively. Through his ongoing mental communication with the beings, Hall began to understand that his role was part of a carefully planned contact protocol. The beings had determined that direct, large-scale contact with human governments or institutions would likely result in fear, panic, and potentially hostile responses. Instead, they had chosen to establish contact through selected individuals who demonstrated the appropriate combination of scientific understanding, emotional stability, and discretion. The weather station at Indian Springs provided an ideal location for this type of limited contact. The isolation ensured privacy and security, while Hall's technical background and careful observational skills made him capable of accurately documenting and understanding what he was experiencing. The beings seemed to be using these contacts to assess human readiness for broader contact and to develop protocols for eventual more extensive interaction. As October arrived and the desert began to experience the first cool nights of autumn, Hall's education in the beings' culture and capabilities continued to expand. He learned that their society was organized around scientific research and exploration, with individual beings specializing in particular fields of study over lifespans that extended for hundreds of Earth years. The group he was in contact with were atmospheric and planetary scientists, part of a larger research team studying Earth's climate system and its interaction with human industrial development. The beings expressed particular concern about the changes they had observed in Earth's atmosphere over the previous century. Their long-term monitoring had detected the beginnings of what would later be recognized as climate change, and they were studying the potential impacts of human industrial activity on the planet's long-term habitability. This research was partly scientific curiosity, but also reflected a genuine concern for the welfare of Earth's biosphere. Through the mental communication, Hall also began to understand something of the being's emotional and psychological nature. Despite their alien appearance and advanced technology, they possessed recognizable emotions and motivations. They experienced curiosity, concern, satisfaction from successful research, and something analogous to affection for the worlds and life forms they studied. Their attitude toward humanity was complex, part scientific interest, part protective concern, and part genuine admiration for human resilience and creativity. The beings had developed a particular appreciation for human music, art, and literature, which they found remarkably sophisticated given humanity's relatively brief period of civilization. They were puzzled and somewhat saddened by humanity's tendency toward warfare and environmental destruction, but they remained optimistic about the species' potential for wisdom and growth. As Hall's understanding of the beings deepened, he began to appreciate the remarkable complexity of the situation he found himself in. He was not simply an observer of alien visitors, but a participant in a carefully orchestrated program of interspecies contact. The beings were studying humanity through him, but they were also teaching him about their own civilization and gradually preparing him for a role he was only beginning to understand. The autumn nights in the Nevada desert were becoming increasingly beautiful as temperatures dropped and the air became crystal clear. During these perfect observing conditions, Hall's encounters with the beings took on an almost ritual quality. They would arrive in their silent craft, conduct their surveys and equipment examinations, and engage in extended mental communication sessions that expanded Hall's understanding of both their science and their culture. These communications were not limited to factual information but included something approaching philosophical discussions about the nature of intelligence, the purposes of scientific exploration, and the responsibilities that came with advanced technology. The beings possessed a deep ethical framework that guided their interactions with other species and their approach to scientific research. Hall learned that their non-interference in human affairs was not indifference, but rather a carefully considered policy based on extensive experience with other developing civilizations. They had learned that premature intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, often disrupted natural development patterns and created more problems than it solved. Their approach was to observe, study, and prepare for eventual contact when a species demonstrated sufficient maturity and wisdom to handle advanced technology responsibly. As October progressed toward November, Hall realized that his relationship with the tall beings had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first arrived at Indian Springs. What had begun as routine weather observations had become participation in one of the most significant events in human history. He was no longer simply Charles Hall, weather observer. He had become humanity's first official ambassador to an alien civilization, though he was perhaps the only person on Earth who understood the true nature of his role. The responsibility was both exhilarating and sobering. Through his careful documentation and gradual understanding of the being's culture and objectives, he was accumulating knowledge that could eventually transform humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Yet the need for secrecy and the isolation of his position meant that he bore this knowledge alone, unable to share it with anyone who might appreciate its significance. As he stood outside the weather station on clear autumn nights, watching the beings conduct their research under the vast canopy of desert stars, Hall understood that he was witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in human history. The tall beings represented not just contact with alien intelligence, but an invitation to join a larger community of civilizations that spanned the galaxy. Whether humanity would prove ready for that invitation remained to be seen, but Hall was determined to play his part in preparing for that eventual day of broader contact. As November settled over the Nevada desert, bringing with it the crisp, clear nights that made the autumn season so remarkable in this harsh landscape, Hall's relationship with the tall beings entered what he would later recognize as its most profound and transformative phase. The cooler temperatures seemed to energize the beings, and their activities around the weather station became more frequent and complex. It was during this period that Hall first encountered what would prove to be the most extraordinary aspect of his entire experience with the tall white visitors, their children. The first indication that the beings had families came during a routine evening observation in mid-November. Hall was outside taking wind measurements when he noticed an unusual pattern in the approaching lights that had become so familiar over the previous months. Instead of the typical formation of adult beings moving across the desert floor, he observed what appeared to be a mixed group that included figures of varying heights and sizes. As the group drew closer to the weather station, Hall realized with astonishment that several of the shorter figures were clearly juveniles, young beings who shared the distinctive physical characteristics of the adults but were obviously still developing. The sight of these young beings fundamentally altered Hall's understanding of what he was witnessing. These were not simply visitors to Earth, conducting temporary research. They were families, multi-generational groups who had established permanent residence in the Nevada desert. The adult beings seemed particularly protective of their young, maintaining careful formation around them as they moved across the terrain. The juveniles, however, displayed a curiosity and energy that was distinctly different from the measured scientific demeanor of their elders. They moved with quick, darting motions, frequently stopping to examine interesting features of the landscape or to investigate objects that caught their attention. Hall's first close encounter with one of the young beings occurred during a particularly memorable evening in late November. He was conducting his usual observations when a small figure, perhaps 4 feet in height, approached much closer to the weather station than any being had previously ventured. This young individual moved with the fearless curiosity typical of children everywhere, apparently fascinated by Hall's meteorological equipment and his activities. The young being's appearance was both familiar and startling. It possessed the same basic physical characteristics as the adults: the pale, luminescent skin, the large, intelligent eyes, the elongated proportions, but these features were rendered with the softness and incomplete development typical of youth. The being's movements were more animated than those of the adults, with a playful quality that reminded Hall powerfully of human children exploring their environment. What struck Hall most forcefully was the obvious intelligence and awareness in the young being's large, dark eyes. Despite its apparent youth, the creature displayed a level of cognitive sophistication that far exceeded anything Hall had observed in human children of comparable developmental stage. The being seemed to understand the function and purpose of Hall's equipment with minimal observation, and its attention was focused and purposeful rather than merely curious. The mental communication that Hall had gradually developed with the adult beings proved even more remarkable with this young individual. The juvenile's thoughts and emotions came through with a clarity and directness that was both delightful and overwhelming. Hall experienced the being's sense of wonder at the human technology, its curiosity about Hall himself, and its excitement at this opportunity for close contact with a member of another species. Through this mental connection, Hall began to understand that the young beings had been observing him for weeks, watching from safe distances while their parents conducted their research and monitoring activities. The juveniles had developed their own theories and speculations about human behavior and technology, and they were eager to test their understanding through direct observation and interaction. The young beings' mental communication also revealed aspects of their society and development that had not been apparent from Hall's interactions with the adults. The juveniles received extensive education from their elders, But this education was conducted through direct mental transmission rather than traditional teaching methods. Knowledge, experience, and understanding were shared directly from adult to young through the same telepathic abilities that Hall had experienced in his own communications with the beings. This educational method allowed the young beings to acquire sophisticated understanding of complex subjects with remarkable speed and thoroughness. The juvenile Hall was communicating with possessed detailed knowledge of atmospheric science, planetary geology, and interstellar navigation that would have required years of study for a human student. Yet this knowledge was seamlessly integrated with the natural curiosity and playfulness that characterized youth in any species. As Hall's encounters with the young beings became more frequent throughout November and December, he began to appreciate the remarkable complexity of their family and social structures. The beings lived in multi-generational groups that included not only parents and children, but also what appeared to be grandparents, aunts, uncles, and extended family networks. These family units were tightly bonded, with each member playing specific roles in the education and protection of the young. The juvenile beings seemed to undergo distinct developmental stages that were marked by increasing independence and expanding capabilities. The youngest individuals remained close to their parents and communicated primarily through emotional and sensory impressions. As they matured, their telepathic abilities became more sophisticated, and they began to participate in the group's research and exploration activities. Hall observed that the adult beings took their parental responsibilities extremely seriously. The safety and education of their young was clearly their highest priority, and they maintained constant vigilance whenever the juveniles were outside their underground facilities. The adults seemed to assess every situation for potential risks to their offspring, and they would immediately withdraw if they detected any possibility of danger or unwanted exposure. This protective behaviour extended to their interactions with Hall. While the adults had gradually come to trust him and had begun sharing increasingly detailed information about their presence on Earth, they were much more cautious when their young were present. Hall understood that he was being evaluated not just as a potential contact with humanity, but as someone who could be trusted around their most precious and vulnerable family members. The underground facilities where the beings lived proved to be far more extensive and sophisticated than Hall had initially understood. Through his mental communications with both adults and juveniles, he began to piece together a picture of vast subterranean complexes that extended for miles beneath the Nevada desert. These facilities were not simply temporary shelters, but permanent communities designed to support multi-generational families over extended periods. The living spaces were carefully designed to accommodate the beings' physical and psychological needs, while maintaining the advanced technology necessary for their research and communication with their homeworld. The facilities included areas for education and development of the young, laboratories for scientific research, communication centers for interstellar contact, and recreational spaces where families could gather and socialize The beings had developed remarkable technologies for creating comfortable living environments deep underground. Their facilities maintained perfect temperature and humidity control, regardless of surface conditions, and they had created artificial lighting systems that closely mimicked the natural light conditions of their homeworld. The young beings seemed particularly to enjoy areas where the lighting could be adjusted to create the equivalent of sunrise and sunset cycles from their distant planet. Most remarkably, the beings had managed to create these extensive facilities without any significant disturbance to the desert ecosystem above them. Their construction methods were so advanced and precisely controlled that the surface landscape showed no signs of the vast communities that existed below. This level of technological sophistication reflected not only their advanced engineering capabilities, but also their deep respect for the environmental integrity of their host planet. As winter deepened and the desert nights became longer and colder, Hall's encounters with the young beings revealed more about their remarkable educational system. The juveniles were taught not only the technical knowledge necessary for their civilization's continued development, but also deep philosophical and ethical principles that guided their interactions with other species and their approach to scientific exploration. The young beings learned from an early age that intelligence and advanced technology carried profound responsibilities. They were taught to approach other life forms with respect and caution, to minimize their impact on alien ecosystems, and to consider the long-term consequences of their actions across timescales that encompass centuries or millennia. This ethical framework was not imposed from outside, but was integral to their psychological development and their understanding of their place in the universe. Hall was particularly moved by the young beings' attitude toward Earth and humanity. Despite their advanced capabilities and sophisticated understanding of the universe, they approached Earth's biosphere with genuine wonder and appreciation. They found the diversity of Earth's life forms endlessly fascinating, and they had developed a deep emotional attachment to the desert landscape that had become their home. The juveniles had spent their entire lives on Earth, and in many ways they considered it their homeworld as much as the distant planet where their species had originated. They had never known any environment other than the Nevada desert, and they had developed an intimate understanding of its rhythms and characteristics that rivaled that of any native species. Through his mental communications with the young beings, Hall began to understand that their presence on Earth represented something far more significant than a temporary research mission. These families had committed to a multi-generational project that would span decades or centuries. The young beings being raised on Earth would eventually take over the research and monitoring responsibilities from their parents, continuing the long-term study of human civilization and planetary development. This realization fundamentally altered Hall's understanding of his own role in the contact scenario. He was not simply witnessing a brief period of alien visitation, but was participating in the establishment of a permanent interspecies relationship. The young beings he was meeting would likely continue their family's presence on Earth long after Hall himself had completed his military service and moved on to other assignments. The implications of this long-term presence were both reassuring and sobering. The being's commitment to Earth suggested a benevolent interest in the planet's welfare and humanity's development. Their careful, patient approach to contact indicated a level of wisdom and restraint that boded well for future relationships. However, it also meant that humanity was under constant observation and study by beings whose technological capabilities far exceeded human understanding. As December progressed and Hall's first year at Indian Springs drew toward a close, his relationship with the young beings deepened into something approaching genuine friendship. The juveniles seemed to have adopted him as an honorary member of their extended family, including him in activities and communications that were normally reserved for their own kind. During one particularly memorable encounter in mid-December, Hall was invited to observe what appeared to be an educational session where adult beings were teaching their young about human technology and behavior. The session took place near the weather station, with Hall's meteorological equipment serving as examples of human engineering and scientific methodology. The adult beings explained to their young the principles behind atmospheric measurement and weather prediction, comparing human techniques to their own far more advanced methods. They discussed the strengths and limitations of human technology with remarkable objectivity, neither dismissing human achievements nor failing to acknowledge the vast differences in technological sophistication. What impressed Hall most about this educational session was the beings' obvious respect for human ingenuity and adaptability. Despite their advanced capabilities, they recognized the remarkable achievement represented by human scientific and technological development. They seemed particularly impressed by humanity's ability to develop sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena, despite having access to relatively primitive measurement and analysis tools. The young beings absorbed these lessons with obvious interest and enthusiasm. They asked penetrating questions about human motivation and methodology, seeking to understand not just how human technology worked, but why humans had chosen particular approaches to solving technical problems. Their questions revealed a deep curiosity about human psychology and the cultural factors that influence technological development. Through these educational sessions, Hall began to understand that his presence at the weather station served multiple purposes for the beings. He was simultaneously a subject of study, a source of information about human culture and technology, and a test case for developing protocols for broader human contact. The beings were using their relationship with him to to prepare their young for eventual interaction with larger segments of human society. This preparation seemed to be part of a carefully planned timeline for expanding contact with humanity. The beings appeared to be working toward a future when their presence would become known to human governments and scientific institutions. However, they wanted to ensure that both their own young and selected humans were ready for such contact before proceeding to more extensive interaction. The young beings' development and education were clearly central to this long-term plan. As they matured and gained experience with human contact through their interactions with Hall, they would eventually be ready to serve as intermediaries between their civilization and humanity. Their unique perspective, having been raised on Earth while maintaining their connection to their species' advanced culture, would make them ideal ambassadors for future interspecies cooperation. As Hall reflected on his experiences during the quiet desert nights, he realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the gradual integration of an alien civilization into Earth's biosphere. The beings were not conquering or exploiting Earth, but were establishing themselves as permanent residents, who would eventually reveal themselves as humanity's neighbors and partners in exploring the universe. The presence of their children on Earth represented the ultimate expression of this commitment. These young beings were not visitors but natives of Earth, as much a part of the planet's community of intelligent life as humanity itself. Their development and education were creating the foundation for a future relationship between species that would be based on mutual understanding, respect, and cooperation, rather than fear or conflict. As December gave way to the new year of 1965, Hall understood that his role in this unprecedented relationship was far from over. The trust and friendship he had developed with both adult and young beings had made him an integral part of their long-term plans for human contact. He was no longer simply a weather observer who had stumbled upon an extraordinary discovery. He had become humanity's first ambassador to a community of beings who represented both Earth's future and its connection to the vast community of intelligent life that populated the galaxy. As the winter of 1965 settled over the Nevada desert, Hall's extraordinary relationship with the tall beings took on new dimensions that would challenge his understanding not only of his alien contacts, but of the very nature of his military assignment. The crisp January air carried with it revelations that would illuminate the complex web of knowledge and secrecy that surrounded both his presence at Indian Springs and the being's long-term residence in the American Southwest. It was during one of the clear, cold nights that characterized the desert winter that Hall first began to suspect his encounters with the tall beings had not gone entirely unnoticed by his military superiors. He was conducting his routine evening observations when he detected the distant sound of vehicles approaching the weather station, an unusual occurrence given that supply runs were not scheduled for another 3 days. Hall quickly completed his atmospheric readings and secured his equipment, following standard protocols for unexpected visits. As the sound of engines grew closer, he could distinguish at least 2 vehicles, possibly 3, moving across the desert terrain toward his isolated outpost. The beings, who had been present in the distance when the vehicles first became audible, had vanished completely into the darkness with their characteristic silent efficiency. The convoy that arrived at the weather station consisted of 2 military jeeps and a larger communications vehicle that Hall had never seen before. The personnel who emerged from these vehicles were not the usual supply drivers or administrative staff he had come to expect. Instead, they appeared to be intelligence officers and technical specialists, identifiable by their bearing, equipment, and the careful way they surveyed the area around the weather station. The senior officer, a colonel whose name tag read Morrison, approached Hall with a kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed intense scrutiny. Colonel Morrison explained that they were conducting routine security evaluations of remote installations, but his questions quickly revealed a much deeper agenda. He inquired about Hall's observations of unusual phenomena, his interactions with personnel from other units, and any activities he might have witnessed that seemed inconsistent with normal military operations. Hall found himself in an extraordinarily delicate position. His contacts with the tall beings had taught him the critical importance of maintaining secrecy about their presence, Yet he was now being questioned by military intelligence officers who might already possess some knowledge of unusual activities in the area. He responded to their questions with careful honesty about his weather observation duties, while avoiding any mention of his encounters with the beings. The colonel's questioning revealed that the military was indeed aware of unusual phenomena in the Nevada desert. Morrison spoke in general terms about unidentified aircraft, unauthorized personnel movements, and electromagnetic anomalies that had been detected by various monitoring systems. However, his questions suggested that the military's understanding of these phenomena was incomplete, and that they were seeking additional information from personnel stationed in remote locations. What became clear during this interview was that Hall's assignment to Indian Springs had not been as routine as he had originally believed. The weather station served legitimate meteorological functions, but it also functioned as an observation post for monitoring unusual activities in the surrounding desert. Hall's careful, methodical nature and his background in atmospheric science had made him an ideal candidate for recognizing and reporting anomalous phenomena. The technical specialists who accompanied Colonel Morrison deployed sophisticated monitoring equipment around the weather station, devices that were far more advanced than anything Hall had seen during his military training. These instruments appeared to be designed for detecting electromagnetic emissions, unusual radiation signatures, and possibly even the kind of advanced propulsion systems that the beings used in their silent aircraft. During the 2 days that the intelligence team remained at the weather station, Hall was forced to maintain a careful balance between cooperation with his military superiors and protection of his contacts with the tall beings. The beings, with their apparent ability to monitor human activities from a distance, seemed to understand the delicate nature of Hall's situation and made no attempt to approach the area while the additional personnel were present. The most revealing aspect of the intelligence team's visit was what Colonel Morrison did not ask about. His questions carefully avoided any specific mention of tall, pale humanoid figures or advanced underground installations. This suggested to Hall that the military possessed at least some knowledge of the being's presence, but was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge this knowledge directly. After the intelligence team departed, Hall was left with a new understanding of his role that was both clarifying and troubling. He was simultaneously a weather observer, an unwitting intelligence asset, and humanity's primary contact with an alien civilization. Each of these roles carried its own responsibilities and dangers, and Hall realized that his future actions would need to account for all three aspects of his situation. The being's response to the military visit was swift and sophisticated. Within hours of the intelligence team's departure, Hall received mental communication indicating that the tall beings had monitored the entire encounter through methods he could not begin to understand. They had observed the deployment of the monitoring equipment, recorded the questions posed to Hall, and analyzed the technological capabilities demonstrated by the military personnel. Through his ongoing mental contact with the beings, Hall learned that this type of military surveillance was not unexpected. The beings had been aware for decades that human governments possessed limited knowledge of their presence, and they had developed elaborate procedures for managing this partial awareness, while maintaining the secrecy necessary for their long-term research objectives. The beings explained that human military and intelligence agencies had been detecting evidence of their activities since at least the 1940s, when the expansion of radar and other electronic surveillance systems had begun to register their aircraft and installations. However, the being's technology was sufficiently advanced that human monitoring could detect only fragmentary evidence of their presence, leading to incomplete and often inaccurate conclusions about their nature and objectives. What fascinated Hall was the being's sophisticated understanding of human institutional psychology and decision-making processes. They had carefully studied the ways in which human governments and military organizations responded to unknown phenomena, and they had developed strategies for managing these responses while protecting their research activities and their families. The beings revealed that they maintained limited contact with selected individuals within human military and scientific institutions. These contacts were carefully chosen for their discretion, scientific integrity, and ability to influence policy decisions in ways that would protect both human and alien interests. However, These relationships were maintained at the highest levels of secrecy, and the individuals involved were often unaware of the full scope of the being's presence on Earth. Hall's role in this complex web of relationships was unique because of his direct, sustained contact with the beings and his position within the military structure. He served as both an unofficial ambassador and an intelligence source, providing the beings with insights into human military capabilities and intentions while serving as a test case for broader contact protocols. As February progressed and Hall adjusted to his new understanding of the multi-layered nature of his assignment, his relationship with the tall beings deepened in ways that reflected their growing trust in his discretion and reliability. They began sharing information about their interactions with other humans, revealing a network of contacts that extended far beyond the Nevada desert. The beings maintained observation posts and limited contact points throughout the American Southwest, with particular concentrations in areas controlled by the military or other government agencies. These locations provided them with opportunities to monitor human technological development while maintaining the security necessary for protecting their families and installations. Hall learned that his weather station was actually one of several contact points where the beings had established relationships with carefully selected human personnel. Other contacts included researchers at government laboratories, military officers involved in advanced technology development, and scientists working on classified projects related to atmospheric and space research. Each of these contact relationships was carefully managed to provide the beings with specific types of information while limiting the risk of broader exposure. The humans involved were typically unaware of the full scope of the being's presence or their connections to other contact points. This compartmentalization protected both the beings and their human contacts from the potential consequences of broader disclosure. The most remarkable aspect of this contact network was the being's ability to maintain it without detection by human intelligence agencies. Despite the sophistication of military and governmental surveillance systems, the beings had managed to establish and maintain relationships with dozens of human contacts over a period of decades without compromising their overall secrecy. This achievement reflected not only their advanced technology, but also their deep understanding of human psychology and institutional behavior. The beings had learned to work within the constraints of human security systems, using the compartmentalization and secrecy that characterized military and scientific organizations to their own advantage. As Hall's second winter at Indian Springs progressed, he began to understand that his relationship with the tall beings was part of a much larger and more complex interaction between their civilization and humanity. What had seemed like a chance encounter between a lone weather observer and alien visitors was actually a carefully orchestrated element of a comprehensive contact program that had been developing for decades. The being's long-term strategy appeared to be focused on gradual preparation for eventual open contact with humanity. They were slowly building a foundation of understanding and trust through their network of individual contacts while carefully monitoring human technological and social development to determine the optimal timing for broader revelation of their presence. Hall's role in this strategy was particularly important because of his position within the military structure and his demonstrated ability to maintain secrecy while building genuine relationships with the beings. His experiences were serving as a model for how broader military contact might be managed when the time came for more extensive interaction. The beings were also using their relationship with Hall to better understand human military culture and decision-making processes. Through their mental communications with him, they gained insights into how military personnel were trained, how they responded to unusual situations, and how information flowed through military command structures. This understanding would be crucial for managing the eventual revelation of their presence to human governments and military leaders. The beings wanted to ensure that such contact would be conducted in ways that minimized fear and hostility, while maximizing the potential for constructive cooperation. As spring returned to the Nevada desert in 1965, bringing with it the warming temperatures and longer days that marked the turning of the seasons, Hall reflected on the extraordinary transformation that his life had undergone during his assignment to Indian Springs. What had begun as a routine weather observation posting had evolved into participation in one of the most significant developments in human history. His relationship with the tall beings had grown from initial wonder and apprehension to genuine friendship and mutual respect. He had become not only a witness to their presence, but an active participant in preparing for humanity's eventual recognition of its place in a larger community of intelligent life. The beings had entrusted him with knowledge and responsibilities that exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. Through his careful documentation of their activities, his participation in their educational programs, and his role as an intermediary between their civilization and humanity, he had become an integral part of a process that would eventually transform human understanding of the universe. Yet Hall also understood that his assignment at Indian Springs would eventually come to an end. Military personnel were typically rotated through remote postings after relatively short periods, and he would eventually be reassigned to other duties. The question that increasingly occupied his thoughts was how the relationships and knowledge he had developed would be preserved and transmitted to those who would continue this unprecedented contact. The beings seemed to understand this concern and had begun preparing for the transition. They had indicated that Hall's replacement would be carefully selected for the same qualities that had made him suitable for contact: scientific background, emotional stability, discretion, and openness to extraordinary experiences. The transition would be managed carefully to ensure continuity in the relationship, while protecting the secrecy that remained essential for the being's security. As Hall continued his daily routine of weather observations and his evening encounters with the beings, he understood that he was living through a unique moment in history. He was simultaneously the last person to experience first contact with an alien civilization, and the first to participate in the establishment of an ongoing relationship between species. The knowledge and experiences he had gained during his time at Indian Springs would stay with him for the rest of his life, shaping his understanding of humanity's place in the universe and his appreciation for the remarkable possibilities that lay ahead. He had been privileged to witness the beginning of a new chapter in human evolution, the transition from a single-planet species to a member of a galactic community of intelligent life. As the desert night settled around the weather station and the familiar lights of the being's aircraft appeared on the horizon, Hall prepared for another evening of contact and communication. Each encounter brought new insights and deepened the relationships that would eventually pave the way for humanity's emergence into a larger universe filled with wonders beyond imagination. It was during one of these spring evenings in April of 1965 that Hall experienced what would become one of his most significant and revealing encounters with the tall beings. The night was particularly clear, with minimal atmospheric disturbance and perfect conditions for both his meteorological observations and the beings' activities. As had become routine, several of the tall figures approached the weather station as Hall completed his evening instrument readings. However, this encounter differed from previous meetings in several important ways. The group that approached included not only the familiar adult beings and their young, but also individuals whom Hall had never seen before. These new figures were distinguished by subtle differences in their clothing and equipment, and they carried themselves with an authority that suggested they held positions of significant responsibility within their society. Through his mental communication with the beings, Hall learned that these individuals were senior researchers and administrators from their primary installation, located deep beneath the Nevada test site, in areas that were inaccessible to human observation. They had come to the weather station specifically to meet with Hall and to conduct their own assessment of the contact relationship that had been developing over the previous months. The presence of these senior beings represented a significant development in the contact protocol. Hall understood that his relationship with the local group had progressed to the point where higher authorities within the alien civilization deemed it worthy of direct attention and evaluation. This was both an honor and a responsibility that carried profound implications for the future of human-alien relations. The senior beings conducted what could only be described as an extensive interview with Hall, using the sophisticated mental communication techniques that he had gradually learned to navigate. They sought to understand not only his personal reactions to contact with their species, but also his insights into human psychology, military culture, and social organization. Their questions revealed a depth of interest in human civilization that went far beyond casual observation. They wanted to understand the fundamental drives and motivations that shaped human behavior, the sources of human creativity and innovation, and the factors that had enabled humanity's rapid technological development, despite the species' relatively recent emergence from primitive agricultural societies. Hall found himself serving as an unofficial anthropologist, explaining human customs, beliefs, and institutional structures to beings whose own civilization had evolved along dramatically different lines. The mental communication process allowed for the transmission of complex concepts and emotional nuances that would have been impossible to convey through conventional language, creating an unprecedented opportunity for genuine cross-species understanding. The senior beings were particularly interested in human religious and philosophical concepts, areas that had apparently proven difficult for them to comprehend through distant observation alone. Hall found himself attempting to explain concepts such as faith, hope, artistic inspiration, and the human relationship with the natural world to minds that approached existence from fundamentally different perspectives. Through these discussions, Hall began to understand that the being's own civilization, despite its advanced technology and sophisticated social organization, had evolved in ways that emphasized scientific rationality and collective decision-making over individual creativity and spiritual exploration. They found human unpredictability both fascinating and challenging, recognizing it as a source of both innovation and conflict. The senior beings also shared information about their own civilization's history and development that provided Hall with a broader context for understanding their presence on Earth. Their species had achieved interstellar travel capability approximately 10,000 Earth years ago, and they had been exploring and studying other worlds for most of their recorded history. Earth had been identified as a world of exceptional interest approximately 5,000 years ago, when their long-range observations had detected the emergence of human civilization and the beginning of rapid technological development. The decision to establish a permanent research presence on Earth had been made approximately 2,000 years ago, with the first installations constructed during what humans would recognize as the Roman Empire period. The beings' long-term presence on Earth had allowed them to observe and document the entire sweep of human history from the perspective of advanced outside observers. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the development of human technology and science, and the gradual expansion of human influence across the planet's surface. Their research had focused particularly on understanding the factors that had enabled humanity's remarkably rapid development compared to other intelligent species they had encountered. Most civilizations required tens of thousands of years to progress from primitive agriculture to spaceflight capability. Yet humanity had accomplished this transition in a mere few thousand years. The beings attributed this rapid development to several unique characteristics of human psychology and social organization: human creativity and individual initiative, human willingness to take risks and explore unknown territories, and human ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances had all contributed to accelerated technological and social progress. However, the beings also expressed concern about certain aspects of human development that they had observed over the centuries: human tendency toward warfare and conflict, human exploitation of environmental resources, and human difficulty in achieving stable long-term social cooperation had all been identified as potential threats to the species' continued advancement. The current phase of human development, characterized by the emergence of nuclear weapons and space exploration capabilities, represented a critical transition point that could determine the species' ultimate fate. The beings had intensified their monitoring and research activities during this period because they recognized that humanity's next few decades would likely determine whether the species would successfully transition to advanced civilization or would destroy itself through warfare or environmental destruction. Hall's role in the contact program was part of a broader effort to assess humanity's readiness for inclusion in what the beings described as the galactic community of advanced civilizations. This community consisted of hundreds of species that had achieved interstellar travel and had developed the social and technological sophistication necessary for peaceful coexistence and cooperation. Membership in this community was not automatic but required demonstration of certain fundamental characteristics, including technological capability, social stability, environmental responsibility, and peaceful intentions toward other species. The being's long-term study of humanity was designed to determine whether and when humans might qualify for inclusion in this larger community. The senior beings explained that Earth's eventual contact with the galactic community was not a matter of if, but when. Humanity's rapid technological development made it inevitable that the species would eventually develop the capability for interstellar travel and would encounter other civilizations. The question was whether this contact would occur under controlled, peaceful circumstances or through unmanaged encounters that could result in conflict or cultural disruption. The being's presence on Earth was part of a comprehensive preparation program designed to ensure that eventual contact would be beneficial for both humanity and the galactic community. They were working to identify and develop relationships with humans who could serve as intermediaries and ambassadors when broader contact became appropriate. Hall's relationship with the local group had demonstrated that such contact could be successful and mutually beneficial. His ability to maintain secrecy while building genuine trust and understanding had proved that humans could be reliable partners in managing the complex challenges of interspecies relations. The senior beings also revealed that they were conducting similar contact experiments with selected individuals in other countries and cultures around the world. These parallel programs were designed to ensure that eventual broader contact would not be limited to any single nation or cultural group, but would involve representatives of humanity's diverse civilizations and perspectives. This global approach reflected the being's understanding that humanity's diversity was one of its greatest strengths, but also one of its greatest challenges for achieving the unity necessary for membership in the galactic community. They were working to identify ways to preserve and celebrate human diversity, while fostering the cooperation and mutual understanding that would be essential for successful interstellar relations. As the lengthy interview session continued through the night, Hall began to understand that his experiences at Indian Springs were part of a historical process much larger and more significant than he had ever imagined. He was not simply witnessing first contact between humanity and an alien species, but was participating in humanity's gradual preparation for a transformation that would fundamentally alter the species' relationship with the universe. The senior beings expressed satisfaction with the progress that had been achieved through Hall's contact relationship. They indicated that the information and insights gained through their interactions with him had contributed significantly to their understanding of human potential and had influenced their recommendations regarding the timeline for broader contact. However, they also emphasized that much work remained to be done before humanity would be ready for full membership in the galactic community. Critical challenges needed to be addressed, including the development of more stable international relations, the establishment of effective environmental protection measures, and the cultivation of social institutions capable of managing advanced technology responsibly. The beings were prepared to provide guidance and assistance in addressing these challenges, but they emphasized that the solutions had to come from humanity itself. External intervention in a species' development, no matter how well-intentioned, typically created more problems than it solved and often prevented the natural growth of wisdom and capability that was essential for long-term success. As dawn approached and the lengthy encounter drew toward a close, the senior beings conveyed to Hall their appreciation for his role in the contact program and their confidence in his continued discretion and reliability. They indicated that his assignment at Indian Springs would likely be extended beyond the normal rotation schedule to allow for continuation of the relationship that had proven so valuable for both species. They also revealed that Hall would eventually be provided with opportunities to visit their underground installations and to meet with other humans who were participating in similar contact programs around the world. These experiences would deepen his understanding of the being's civilization and would prepare him for expanded responsibilities in facilitating human-alien relations. The prospect of such expanded contact was both thrilling and sobering for Hall. He understood that he was being invited to become a permanent bridge between two civilizations, a role that would require him to balance loyalties and responsibilities in ways that no human had ever been asked to do before. As the senior beings prepared to depart, they performed a ceremony that Hall would later recognize as a formal acceptance of him as an honorary member of their extended community. The ritual involved the sharing of mental and emotional connections that created bonds of trust and mutual obligation that transcended species boundaries. As the being's aircraft departed into the lightening sky and Hall completed his morning observations, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation that his life had undergone. He had begun his assignment as a routine weather observer and had become humanity's first official ambassador to an advanced alien civilization. The knowledge and responsibilities he now carried would shape the rest of his life and would eventually contribute to one of the most significant developments in human history. He was no longer simply Charles Hall from Minnesota, but had become a critical link in the chain of relationships that would eventually connect humanity to the vast community of intelligent life that populated the galaxy. As the summer of 1965 approached its end, Hall found himself facing the inevitable conclusion of his extraordinary assignment at Indian Springs. Military personnel rotations were inflexible institutional requirements, and despite the unprecedented nature of his contact relationship with the tall beings, the time had come for him to prepare for reassignment to other duties. The prospect of leaving the Nevada desert and the remarkable community he had come to know filled him with a profound sense of both loss and responsibility. The beings had anticipated this transition long before Hall received his official reassignment orders. Their understanding of military bureaucracy and personnel management had led them to begin preparations for continuity of contact months in advance. Through their mental communications, they assured Hall that his departure would not represent an end to the relationship, but rather a transformation that would allow for expanded contact opportunities in new contexts. During his final weeks at the weather station, Hall experienced a series of encounters that were clearly designed to provide closure and to prepare him for his future role as a bridge between civilizations. The being seemed determined to ensure that he left Indian Springs with a complete understanding of what he had witnessed and experienced, and with the knowledge necessary to fulfill his continuing responsibilities as humanity's unofficial ambassador. One of the most significant of these final encounters occurred during a warm August evening when Hall was invited to accompany several of the beings on what they described as a comprehensive tour of their primary installation beneath the Nevada test site. This unprecedented invitation represented the ultimate expression of trust and acceptance, allowing Hall to witness aspects of their civilization that had never been revealed to any human observer. The journey to the underground facility began with Hall being transported in one of the being's silent aircraft, an experience that provided him with first-hand exposure to their remarkable propulsion technology. The craft moved without any sensation of acceleration or motion, gliding effortlessly across the desert landscape at speeds that would have been impossible for any human aircraft of that era. The entrance to the underground complex was located in an area of the Nevada test site that was completely inaccessible to human personnel, hidden beneath what appeared to be natural rock formations but which actually concealed sophisticated camouflage technology. The facility extended far deeper into the earth than Hall had ever imagined, with multiple levels connected by transportation systems that seemed to operate on principles completely foreign to human engineering. The scale and sophistication of the installation were breathtaking. Vast chambers housed communities of beings engaged in research, education, and family life, while other areas contained technological systems whose purposes Hall could barely begin to comprehend. The facility was entirely self-sufficient, generating its own power through methods that produced no waste or environmental impact, recycling all materials with perfect efficiency and maintaining ideal living conditions regardless of surface weather or geological conditions. Hall was particularly moved by his visit to the residential areas where the beings' families lived. He saw children of various ages engaged in educational activities that seamlessly blended learning with play, their large intelligent eyes bright with curiosity about their human visitor. The family structures were complex and multi-generational, with individual units connected to larger community networks that provided support, education, and social interaction. The being's educational system was unlike anything in human experience. Knowledge was transmitted directly through mental contact, allowing young beings to acquire sophisticated understanding of complex subjects with remarkable speed and retention. However, this technical knowledge was always accompanied by ethical and philosophical training that emphasized responsibility, compassion, and respect for all forms of life. During his tour, Hall also visited the research laboratories where teams of beings studied everything from atmospheric dynamics to human psychology. The scope of their research was staggering, encompassing not only Earth-based phenomena, but also comparative studies involving dozens of other worlds and civilizations. Hall saw data archives that contained thousands of years of observations, tracking the development of life and intelligence across vast regions of the galaxy. Perhaps most remarkably, Hall was shown the communication centers where the beings maintained contact with their home world and with other research installations throughout their civilization's sphere of influence. The technology involved transcended simple radio transmission, utilizing principles of physics that allowed for instantaneous communication across interstellar distances. Through these communication systems, Hall learned that Earth was part of a vast network of worlds under observation and study by the being's civilization. Each installation reported its findings to central research coordinators who compiled and analyzed data from hundreds of different planets and species. Earth's rapid development and unique characteristics had made it a subject of particular interest and attention within this larger research program. The beings explained that Hall's experiences and observations during his time at Indian Springs had been transmitted to their homeworld and had contributed to important policy decisions regarding the timeline and methods for eventual open contact with humanity. His demonstration of human capability for discretion, adaptability, and interspecies cooperation had influenced their civilization's assessment of humanity's readiness for broader contact. As his tour of the facility continued, Hall began to understand the immense complexity of the being's long-term mission on Earth. They were not simply conducting scientific research, but were serving as guardians and guides for humanity's development during a critical period in the species' evolution. Their presence represented a form of cosmic mentorship, designed to help humanity navigate the challenges of transition to advanced civilization. The beings had identified numerous potential paths for human development, ranging from successful integration into the galactic community to various forms of self-destruction or cultural stagnation. Their ongoing monitoring and limited intervention were designed to increase the probability of positive outcomes while respecting humanity's right to determine its own destiny. Hall's role in this process had been to demonstrate the potential for successful human-alien cooperation while providing the beings with insights into human psychology and culture that could not be obtained through distant observation alone. His experiences had helped them refine their understanding of human nature and had contributed to the development of protocols for eventual broader contact. During his final days at the underground facility, Hall participated in what could only be described as a graduation ceremony, where he was formally recognized as an honorary member of the being's research community and was provided with knowledge and responsibilities that would guide his future activities. The ceremony involved the sharing of mental and emotional connections that created permanent bonds between Hall and the beings he had come to know. The beings also provided Hall with methods for maintaining contact with them after his departure from Indian Springs. They explained that he would be able to communicate with them through meditation techniques and mental disciplines that they had taught him during his time at the weather station. This ongoing contact would allow them to provide guidance and support as he adapted to his new responsibilities. Perhaps most importantly, the beings revealed that Hall's reassignment had not been entirely coincidental. They had influenced his military career path to ensure that his next posting would place him in a position where he could continue to serve their mutual objectives while developing new aspects of the human-alien relationship. As September arrived and Hall prepared to leave Indian Springs for the final time, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation that his life had undergone during his 2 years in the Nevada desert. He had arrived as a young weather observer with a rural background and conventional expectations about his military service. He was leaving as humanity's first ambassador to an advanced alien civilization, carrying knowledge and responsibilities that would shape the rest of his life. The beings had given him not only an understanding of their own civilization, but also a new perspective on humanity's place in the universe. He had learned that Earth was not an isolated world but part of a vast community of inhabited planets, each contributing to the ongoing evolution of intelligence and consciousness throughout the galaxy. Hall's experiences had also taught him that the universe was fundamentally benevolent, populated by advanced civilizations that sought to nurture and guide the development of younger species rather than exploit or dominate them. The being's patient, careful approach to contact with humanity reflected wisdom gained through millennia of experience with other developing civilizations. As he packed his personal belongings and prepared the weather station for his replacement, Hall was visited one final time by the group of beings who had become his friends and teachers during his extraordinary assignment. The encounter was both a farewell and a commissioning, as they formally entrusted him with his ongoing responsibilities as a bridge between worlds. The beings conveyed their confidence in Hall's ability to fulfill his future role while maintaining the discretion that remained essential for protecting both their presence and his own safety. They explained that he would eventually meet other humans who had participated in similar contact programs, forming a network of individuals who would work together to prepare humanity for eventual open contact. The mental communication that Hall had developed with the beings would remain active throughout his life, allowing him to receive guidance and to contribute ongoing observations about human development and readiness for broader contact. He would serve as both a student and teacher, learning from the beings while helping them understand the complexities of human civilization. Hall's replacement at Indian Springs had been carefully selected by the beings working in cooperation with military personnel assignment officers who were unaware of the true nature of their selection criteria. The new weather observer possessed the same combination of scientific background, emotional stability, and openness to unusual experiences that had made Hall suitable for contact. The transition would be managed carefully to ensure continuity of the relationship, while protecting the secrecy that remained essential for the being's security. Hall would brief his replacement on the technical aspects of weather observation, while the beings would gradually introduce themselves and begin building the trust necessary for continued contact. As Hall's final night at Indian Springs arrived, he stood outside the weather station one last time, looking up at the vast desert sky where countless stars marked the locations of worlds and civilizations beyond human imagination. The beings had given him not only knowledge of their own presence, but awareness of the incredible diversity and richness of life throughout the universe. The desert that had seemed so empty and barren when he first arrived now teemed with invisible activity and purpose. Beneath the sand lay sophisticated installations housing communities of beings, dedicated to understanding and protecting the development of life throughout the galaxy. Above in the starlit sky, aircraft moved silently on missions of research and guardianship that spanned decades and centuries. Hall understood that his departure from Indian Springs marked not an ending, but a beginning. He was leaving the weather station, but not leaving his relationship with the beings. He was transitioning from direct daily contact to a more complex role that would involve him in the long-term preparation for humanity's eventual emergence into the galactic community. The knowledge and experiences he carried with him would influence every aspect of his future life. He would pursue advanced education in atmospheric science and eventually develop a career that would put him in contact with other researchers and government officials who were unknowingly involved in the gradual preparation for broader contact. Hall would also eventually write detailed accounts of his experiences, carefully disguised as fiction to protect the being's security while preserving the essential truth of what had occurred. These writings would serve multiple purposes, preparing selected readers for the realities of alien contact while providing the beings with insights into human reactions to such revelations. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert on Hall's final morning at Indian Springs, he completed his last weather observation and secured the equipment that had served as the foundation for his extraordinary encounters. The routine that had structured his days for 2 years was ending, but the relationships and responsibilities he had developed would continue for the rest of his life. The beings had taught him that consciousness and intelligence were not accidents of evolution, but expressions of fundamental properties of the universe itself. Life emerged wherever conditions permitted, and intelligence developed whenever life achieved sufficient complexity. The universe was not empty and hostile, but was filled with communities of beings working together to nurture and guide the ongoing development of consciousness and understanding. Hall's role in this cosmic community was just beginning. His experiences at Indian Springs had prepared him for a lifetime of service as a bridge between humanity and the larger universe of intelligent life. He would carry the wisdom and perspective gained through his contact with the tall beings into every aspect of his future work and relationships. As the military transport arrived to take him away from Indian Springs for the final time, Hall took one last look at the weather station that had been his home and the site of humanity's first sustained contact with an advanced alien civilization. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, keeping its secrets beneath the burning sun, while somewhere in the vast underground installations, the tall beings continued their patient work of research and guardianship. The journey that had begun with a young weather observer's assignment to a remote desert outpost was transforming into a lifelong mission that would help prepare humanity for its destiny among the stars. Hall carried with him not only memories of extraordinary encounters, but also the knowledge that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that wonderful possibilities awaited those who were ready to embrace them. As the transport vehicle carried him across the desert toward his new assignment and his expanded role in the ongoing contact between civilizations, Hall understood that his story was part of a much larger narrative that would eventually encompass all of humanity. The tall beings who had walked beside him in the Nevada desert had shown him glimpses of a future where humanity would take its place among the stars, contributing its own unique gifts to the vast community of intelligence that populated the galaxy. The desert gradually disappeared behind him, but the relationships and responsibilities he had developed there would remain with him forever, guiding his steps along the long journey that would eventually lead humanity home to its place in the cosmic community of advanced civilizations